You're listening to a podcast by the Perennial Leader Project. To learn more, visit perennial.substack.com. Welcome back to another episode of In Search of Wisdom. I hope this finds everyone feeling wise and well. On today's episode, my guest is John Oakes, author of The Fast, The History, Science, Philosophy, and Promise of Doing Without. In the conversation, we explore John's spontaneous initiation into fasting and his insights from the practice. We delve into the historical prevalence across various cultures and religions, its philosophical and spiritual dimensions, fasting's effect on the mind and body, and so much more. I really enjoyed this one and John's book, The Fast, and hope you do as well. All right, without any further delay, please welcome the wise and gracious John Oakes. John, welcome to In Search of Wisdom.
Josh, thank you so much for having me on.
It's a pleasure to have you, and today we're going to be discussing your book, The Fast. And to get us started, I was wondering if you could share how you initially came to have an interest in the topic.
Well, it actually came at the end of the Trump presidency, since you're asking. And I really just wanted to have a restart. And I really kind of spontaneously decided to do this. I am not for want of better words, I'm not a health nut. I'm not obsessed with that stuff. I'm interested in it, but fasting is not something I've done regularly, but I just wanted to sort of purge myself. I wanted to have a restart. And I thought, I really did just think I want to go on an intense fasting experience. I'm not going to, it never crossed my mind to spend thousands of dollars going to a health spa or something. I don't have that. So I didn't want to do that anyway. And as the days passed, I got kind of interested in what was happening to me and sort of this spacey feeling I was getting. And I wanted to read about I wanted to find out more about it. And that's really how the book came into being.
Well, I love it. And I love the approach that you took for the book. It's definitely, the subtitle talking about the history, science, philosophy, and promise of doing without. I found it interesting when you think about the history piece of it. You talk about in the book, and many people are familiar with like Jesus, Buddha, but even back to the Norse god Odin.
Yeah.
Fasting has been around. So could you talk a little bit about the history?
Sure. I think, you can't prove it, but it seems reasonable that as from day one, when Neanderthals, for that matter, whenever there was any sort of organized society and people had a little extra, there had to be the option of not consuming it all, of not putting it aside for consumption at a later date, of just stepping back and stepping out of the run of things and seeing what it was like just to hold back. Where you have fasting is interesting to me because it's very different from famine or starvation, because with a fast, you have the opportunity to consume, to eat, or to do whatever it is, to sleep or to have sex. Also, that's a kind of fasting, or to talk for that matter, but you choose not to. And it is a temporary assertion of your will over whatever sort of, in quotes, normal inclination you have. And you're saying, I'm just going to take a pause, whether it's for a few hours or a few days or even a few weeks, and I'm just going to live differently. And then I'm going to go back into what I was doing. And I think for me, it was a very interesting impulse. And then when you look around, you see it's everywhere. It's in every single major world religion. Of course, it's in Christianity and Lent, and in Judaism, it has a number of fasting days. Islam has Ramadan. In Buddhism, it's, part of the core of the concept of Buddhism, pulling back and reconsidering what you're doing. It's really in just about every religion. In fact, even in the one major religion I found where fasting is explicitly not part of the doctrine, Sikhism, it's a way to differentiate themselves, the Sikhs, from the dominant religions in their area, Hinduism and Buddhism, which have fasting very much a part of their traditions. So it really is something that pops up all over the place. And even before these world religions, you certainly find it throughout Greek philosophy, and it stands to reason it goes back to the beginning.
It's interesting. Like when you bring up religion, philosophy, that's one of the questions I noted down that I'm curious about. When it comes to the practice of fasting, should we think about it as a spiritual or philosophical exercise? Is that historically how people thought about fasting?
Well, Josh, as you know from the book, I'm very, I don't believe in being doctrinaire about it. I think people should do, I think it's a beneficial, if applied in limited quantities. I do not think people should go out there and fast for, a month on end. I think that that's demonstrably unhealthy, and you really shouldn't do it. Though people say they do it, and, more power to them. But I think people should do what they want to do. But I think you definitely, if you approach it not just as a health thing, or not even primarily as a health thing, but you use it as a moment, a meditation, if you will. And that tradition, of course, is now largely associated with Eastern religions, but it's very present in the Judeo-Christian tradition and as well. I think it's beneficial. Certainly for me, I found it as I've gotten more into it, and I do these long fasts twice a year. I find it empowering, and just to know I can comfortably go a week or more without food. This is something I never would have thought I was capable of doing. I'm not a survivor type. I'm not, somebody out there with a knife and a string and one match, living in the deep woods. But it gives you, when you fast for an extended period, it gives you this huge amount of time. You're not shopping for food or going or buying food. You're not preparing it. You're of course not eating it. And suddenly you have this big clump of time, and it's a wonderful opportunity to sort of think about who you are, your relationship to other people, their relationship to you, and even if it's not too much to say, your connection to the universe. And, whether you're religious or not, it's a great opportunity that's available to all of us.
Beautiful. I'm curious, as someone who has not ever, partaked in any sort of long fast, what would you say you learn about yourself, engaging in this ancient practice?
Well, speaking again for myself, I think it's very important because we all share so much, but we're all different too. For myself, it made me realize I'm maybe a little stronger than I realized, and that there are these, and I would venture to say it's true of all of us, that of course we are all vulnerable beings, but we're also all stronger in some capacity than perhaps we know. And because, you get into these routines, which is natural. That's a human trait, or I guess it's an animal trait. You live your life in routine, but then sometimes breaking out of that routine, you can discover wonderful things about yourself. And that's as I say, that's an empowering thing. I do want to emphasize, I mean, I don't think everyone's set up to fast for long periods of time. As I've indicated, I'm not particularly athletic, but, I'm thinking of my late mother who was, she couldn't have weighed 100 pounds, just a little bit of a thing. And, if she were to, if she were to have fasted for, 3 days or 2 days, I think she would have collapsed. And that's not something you want to aim for. But I think for somebody who's in reasonably good health, you're drinking plenty of water and you're not overdoing it. It could be, you really can discover new things about yourself.
I think it's just such an interesting thing of I don't know. I have this fascination with, maybe you'd call it the discipline of desire, in Buddhism, clinging and attachment and all sorts of stuff, where we can get the feeling that we need to have lunch, like it's an absolute requirement. And it's just interesting, I think, to contemplate that these things that we may think that we need are not actually things that we need. At least, maybe you wouldn't want to do that every single day, but I'm saying just the being aware that our minds, the desires, all sorts of things that feel like needs, of maybe questioning them a bit. So I'm curious, what is your mind doing when you're, engaging in something like this, and maybe you're on day 2? I'm assuming your mind is kind of talking to you, I guess, if you will.
Well, what's one of the really cool things I found out, and I don't mean to say it's exclusive to me, but I was totally ignorant of this, is that it's not only your mind talking to you, Josh, it's also within our bodies. We have this thing called the enteric nervous system, which involves your stomach and your whole digestive system. And it's sometimes called the brain in the gut. And obviously it depends on the person, but roughly there are as many neurons in the brain in the gut as there are, and I guess it also depends on the dog, but in a dog's brain. So you have sort of a dog's brain in your gut. And that's actually not a bad analogy, because the gut is directing you, saying, Josh, where are my morning eggs and coffee? And, why didn't you get me bacon? And to sort of, to have the mind wrestle with that a bit. It really is a separate, they're obviously connected, but there's this incredible, really awesome chemical and biological and neurological network that goes on when you don't stick to routine, and your brain, the enteric system starts sending these signals to the brain, and then all these hormones start coursing through the body and, really pushing you to get those eggs and that bacon. And at the first couple of days, since you said couple of days, it gets a little tough. And you're really wrestling with your stomach. I think most people have this situation. But by about day 3, things settle down. And then your body starts issuing different set of chemicals, things like serotonin, which is sometimes called the happy hormone. And then there's stuff called cannabinoids, which sounds like they're related. They're really not very far from cannabis. And your body produces this. And many people, including me, experience this, serenity may be too big a word, but a certain leveling out. You sort of calm down. And I certainly found that around day 3. And you feel a certain peace. And I think that also comes from not having all the clutter of food that you got to stuff into yourself and manage. And as I said before, purchase and clean up and all that kind of thing. But there is an actual biological thing that's going on in your body, which to me is really neat. And some people, for example, Cesar Chavez, who was a very famous labor leader, he loved to go on these long fasts. And he said that around day 5, he would have developed this incredible memory, and he could recount conversations word for word. And I guess it's called an eidetic memory. That never has happened to me. I'm still as forgetful as I always am. But you do feel a little, and that's cool for, I think, too, because you sort of experience a different version of yourself. And that's a privilege for me. And yeah. And so then, around, it sort of levels off, and around day 5, day 6, and I've never gone beyond, I guess, 9 days, but I just never felt the need to. At some point, at least for me, it gets boring. You want to go back to tasting. You really long for the taste of bread or spice or something. Food is exciting, and that's yet another benefit to a fast. You get to revisit things you take for granted, and you think, oh wow, this apple or this carrot or candy bar or whatever. It's really at all these flavors and these extraordinary levels that I hadn't appreciated before. And then I don't mean to go on so long, Josh. I'm sorry.
No, I
don't
love
mean,
it.
but
Great.
then if you're like me, I go back to forgetting, and I eat my apple or carrot or candy bar and, forget how immensely complicated these various flavors are that you're gulping down. But for a period of time, right after the fast, you really appreciate this incredible environment that we're participating in, no matter where or who we are.
I really appreciate you sharing, your experience of it. It's such a fascinating thing, and I appreciate you sharing. Have you ever seen some of these survival shows on TV, like Alone and Naked and Afraid type of stuff?
I've seen bits of them, as you might. I think you may have guessed. I'm not a big fan of those, but I have. Just the other day, I was grilling some friends who are real fans of these sorts of shows, and trying to figure out what was the attraction there. For me, it's not something, but I respect that. I don't quite understand it, but I sure know that people are really interested in these sort of private, intimate views of other people's lives. But
yeah,
why do you ask?
Well, you mentioned something there in the way of the appreciation piece of it, of coming to something and maybe really experiencing all of the flavor of this particular thing after going without. And I've always been kind of astonished by how much some of these, contestants that are on these things, and these are experts. I'm not really I have no idea about any of that type of survival stuff for the most part, but these are real experts. And some of their experience of a bite of fish or some sort of, maybe even less appealing thing like a bug or a snake or something they are so over the moon. I sometimes think, wow, I don't think I've ever experienced anything like the experience that they're having. And I'm sure there's something to do with the whole, in a survival thing, and they've literally, from a primal thing, they've literally caught, but also just the appreciation. I don't think I've seen too many people in some of those things not have a deep, deep appreciation for this animal, that it's giving its life, for their nourishment. Where when I go to the local supermarket, I'm oftentimes, I can hopefully try to remind myself, but oftentimes I'm very detached, from that connection with this animal that is given its life for my nourishment.
Absolutely. What we experience when we go into the supermarket, or we're just, sort of half asleep ordering a burger at the drive-in or whatever, we experience what neuropsychologists call automaticity, and which is this your brain, once you do something repeatedly, your brain sort of puts it into a special place. So you don't really devote any energy to thinking about it. You go through the routine. And this is really a neurological phenomenon. And by breaking that routine, you set these new pathways, and then of course, you're going to set them again if you go back to that same behavior, but at least for a time, then you can treat it as something, a new experience. And you start thinking, as you're, to use the example you gave, you're buying a steak or something, and maybe for the first time in a long time, you're thinking, oh, I wonder how this really got to me. And I wonder what's behind this slab of meat that, how did it come to be here? And the animal that has given it to me.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, I think that in a way, for me at least, a fast is a kind of a meditation. And like meditation, even if and I'm not the kind of person who's good at sitting still and closing my eyes for, I tried it. I really did, but it's just not my thing. But I think like meditation, when you open, you don't sleep, obviously, when you're meditating, and you open your eyes and you see the world afresh. I think it has can have that same power. I mean, of course, there's many different kinds of fasting, and fasting itself can become a kind of automaticity. We all know about intermittent fasting, which a lot of people do for health. For me, that didn't have much attraction, and it actually seemed much harder because, I just don't think I have that kind of discipline, but a lot of people swear by it, of course.
Related to that, I'd be curious to have you differentiate, what makes something a fast, what makes something intermittent fasting. Could you unpack that for, people that may not be familiar?
Sure. So fasting is the overall term for having the ability to consume something and then choosing not to. And intermittent fasting is something that's popped up really in the last, couple of decades. It came up with this thing called calorie restriction, CR, where it was found that some studies started occurring, starting with a guy called Roy Walford, that cutting back seriously on our caloric intake seems to extend one's lifespan. And that's just been repeatedly affirmed by subsequent studies. And so there are all sorts of programs of intermittent fasting where people say they don't eat from, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. on some days, or they go, Mondays and Wednesdays without dinner. There are a million different ways to do it. And it's all in the service of trying to get us to eat less, and almost always for health and for people's sense of wellness. As I say, that's not my primary focus, but it's certainly something I'm interested in. But I was much more interested in the philosophical, and then also, I guess, I guess also the scientific aspects of fasting. But yeah, I mean, athletes often fast. And I give the example in the book, Achilles, fasted before going into battle. In the Bible, the ancient Jews often fasted before going out to battle people. It's a way also of preparing your body. And I guess that's a kind of a intermittent fasting.
How about maybe in pretty recent times, you have things like the carnivore diet, obviously a vegan diet and things like that have, been around a bit longer, but these are common terms in, in our culture today. Are those a type of fast? Is that in the category of it?
Absolutely. I mean, people might quibble with this, but as far as I'm concerned, absolutely would be a kind of fast. Although if you're a committed vegetarian or vegan, or for that matter, carnivore, it's not really a fast because you're embracing that as a permanent setup. So I think, a vegetarian doesn't see herself as fasting from meat. But I think in a sense it is, because you're choosing not to consume something. I think that could fall within the category. But yeah.
I'm also curious to ask around weight loss, health, that type of stuff. Why is thinking about the practice of fasting, why is it a bad idea to think about it as a path to weight loss and things like that?
I'm glad you mentioned that, Josh, because it's really been shown that, I mean, obviously, again, it's going to depend on the person, but really up to 80% of your weight is genetically predetermined, and you can have some effect on that. But fasting is not a road to permanently keep off weight. And also, it's probably not that healthy. Anorexia is a different issue. It's also more and more people are coming to feel that it's genetically a genetic issue. Of course, people are pushed into that by a consumerist culture, but fasting for weight loss is just simply ineffective. You don't eat and your body's functioning over time, you're going to lose weight. But then, if you're a normal person, you gain it right back again. So that's not a healthy, and certainly it's a profoundly unsatisfying, because it won't work, road to attempt weight loss. I think you have to have a sustained program. I'm not a weight loss expert, but that's something that is much more involved. But I do think that it can give us many substantial benefits, primarily spiritual ones, and then overall, if one sticks with it, if you consume less, it gives your body a break, and there has been there are many scientific studies that it does give your body kind of a chance to reset, and gives it a break from all that consuming that we're doing, often 3 times a day or more. And it's the poor corpus that the flesh and bones and guts that we're running around, and it gives it a little vacation from that.
Yeah, which is interesting. It's probably been, if we look at throughout human history, maybe 99.9% of it probably had some of these natural breaks in it, just from a scarcity standpoint, and the absence of convenience and refrigerators and microwaves and all sorts of stuff.
And even this thing I mentioned earlier, where about day 3, you get all these happy hormones coursing through your system. We don't know, but it seems likely that is the reaction of the human biology to say, okay, so I can't, the body, the brain is not getting me food, so I have to come up with something else to give it a sort of surge in energy and in cognition, so that it can go out and hunt down that antelope and get me back to a full stomach. So I do think that, there's this evolutionary basis in fasting, which makes sense too. I mean, it's sort of a logical sequence that's going on.
Yeah. There was a quote that I thought was attributed to C.S. Lewis. I never verified or whatever, but I remember hearing it a long, long time ago, and it's always stuck with me. And it's something along the lines of perspective. It depends on how we think about things. And he gives the example of, someone that is starving for 3 days is going without food. And then on the other hand, someone that is in this case of a fast, of this willful thing, fasting for 3 days is something completely different. So I'm just curious if there's anyone
Absolutely.
listening that is maybe interested in,
Mhm.
and, maybe you'd recommend consulting a doctor and things like that, I'm sure, before you engage in something like this. But, how do we prepare ourselves mentally or prepare ourselves to engage in this practice?
Josh, you've absolutely hit on, I think, a core concept. It's a matter of volition and what sometimes is called agency. It's asserting oneself and saying that I have a role. I don't have a complete role in my destiny, but I can affect it. I can't be sure I'm not going to be hit by a meteor when I next walk outside, but I have some limited control over my future. And one way I'm going to impose that control is by choosing not to eat for a bit. So if you're going into this, but to get back to your question about setting up a fast, it can be, if you haven't done it, it can be sort of a daunting experience. It certainly was for me. It's much easier to do it with a friend or a partner, somebody, the two of you can complain to each other about how lousy you feel the first day or two and, how noble you are, and then help you help each other get through the first day or two. But then, I think, and again, it depends on the person, but there's a great freedom in realizing that you have the power. If you're a relatively healthy person, you can comfortably go a week or more without food as long as you have enough liquids, and that's okay. And what you say is a key thing for people who aren't sort of prepared and expecting this. If suddenly food is taken away, people panic, and it's a natural, and that's a real thing too. And so, if stores are empty in some sort of disaster or something unforeseen, people very reasonably panic. And of course, if for little kids, this is something that should not be done. And yeah, but for a reasonably healthy adult, it's fine. But the shock of not having any decision in the matter, I think that would make one panic and would be a very bad thing, of course.
I'm curious about, back to the desire thing, as I was saying, it's an interest of mine.
Yeah.
So we talked about consumer age, and we're obviously marketed to, and, influences in culture try to influence us, obviously, to do certain things. Do you think this particular practice maybe has shifted your perspective on consuming in general, like from a mimetic desire standpoint of maybe the neighbor gets a new car and
definitely,
strangely, we want a new car. Does this kind of help in that area?
It definitely makes me think more about it. And it makes me, again, speaking for myself, makes me appreciate much more what I have. Makes me, when I think of it, that's a thing, because so often I go about my daily life in an unthinking fashion. But when I think of the lessons of the fast, you can't help but consider, do you really need that second box of raspberries? Aren't you going to be content with, just one package of M&Ms or something? Why do you need to stock up? All that kind of stuff. I'm obviously choosing simplistic ideas, but I think that we are battling not only against our stomachs, but also against a whole system which has its very good side, but it wants to lull us into doing stuff that, might not be so, not only good for our bodies, but good for our wallets. And, that's the way I love living in the United States. And I really appreciate so many of our values, but that is a fundamental aspect that many other people pointed out is just sort of very, very American over consumption, which just means getting stuff you don't need or even particularly want, but you sort of feel compelled to do it. And if you're not consuming, there's something wrong with you.
Hmm. What a wonderful thing, though, if as a practice, something to just think again, or just some sort of, I'm thinking about that famous Viktor Frankl quote of, between stimulus and response, that space, like how can you have a bit of a pause or have a bit of a space to just simply reflect, is this something I truly need? Yeah, it's really, really interesting. To transition into wisdom, as I sent an email to you, and we generally wrap up with, a bit of time on the topic of wisdom. So I'm curious if there's, any thoughts in the way of, connecting this practice with wisdom, or how you define or think about wisdom in daily life, John.
Well, Josh, I would say that because I came to this fasting experience and because it's been such a gift to me, and it came to me really quite late in life. I was past 60 when I started doing it, and I found it so exciting and such a gift. I mean, for me, the connection to wisdom is that you just have to stay open to new experiences within reason. Of course, I'm not about to go bungee jumping, but that staying open to the unknown can really benefit you in ways that obviously you can't predict because you don't know what it is. And fasting certainly has done that for me. And I'm really deeply appreciative of the experiences you probably could hear. I guess that would be my take on the matter.
Beautiful. I'm curious, this may be a difficult one to answer. It's difficult to predict the future, but do you think this, practice of fasting will stay with you indefinitely, or do you think there'll be a time where you stop?
I have no doubt about most things, but I really am very confident that this is something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. It's one of the wonderful things about it is that you don't need anything to do it. You just need yourself. And I find that also exciting and wonderful that there's this universe inside all of us. I guess that sounds a little bit mushy, but it's actually true. And to really experience that, which you can't in the daily course of things, you have to carve out some space to appreciate what's inside you, what's inside all of us. And that is something I don't see why I ever would lose it. I hope I never do put that aside and neglect it entirely.
What a beautiful thing. We talk about sometimes on here and then on a newsletter that I do of perennial habits, some of these ancient practices, and how do we think about these things as lifelong practices instead of just maybe life hacks? Not that there's anything wrong with life hacks per se, but is there anything that comes to mind of helping us think lifelong or long term? And maybe to me that connects in terms with wisdom, like the search for wisdom is maybe not a 6-month endeavor and then we've checked that box and move on. But how do we think lifelong like that?
I think one way to think about it is just some of the themes we've touched on is that we all carry with us the tools I don't want to say we carry within us all the tools to achieve, ultimate karmic authority or wisdom or nirvana or whatever it is. But I think the truth is we do all have with us what we need to achieve some kind of stability and serenity, whether you're sitting in a prison cell or you're sitting in a mansion in, Miami Beach. You have the same ability and the same also hindrances. And there's something awesome about that unites us all at whatever level, and also gives us the same strengths and susceptibility to weaknesses outside to outside forces. I think
Nice.
yeah.
Well, nice. I'm grateful for your time, John. Again, I've really enjoyed the book. It's The Fast. I'll put a link in the show notes so it's easy to find for people.
You're very nice. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Before we wrap up, is there anything we didn't cover, any sort of misconceptions, misunderstandings, concerns around fasting that we should mention before we wrap up?
Yeah, the only thing I'd say, and obviously this is up to you, that I think it's important that people, for me, fasting is a discussion of borders and of limits. And that as such, you don't want to sort of go into it. It's not a contest. And so you don't want to, I think, have a fast without end is anorexia. And that's a bad thing, right? You're not doing the fast to die. You're doing the fast to achieve a level of insight and of appreciation of what's around us and the extraordinary things life has to offer. And I think some people seem to regard it as sort of a, like a voyage to Antarctica or something barefoot. and it shouldn't be that way. It should be whatever makes you feel comfortable. It should be a contained exercise. I think that's very important. I don't, yeah.
No, I love that. I appreciate that. A contained exercise. It's not a contest. I could see myself getting trapped into into something like that. So I really, appreciate you saying that. All right, John Oakes, thank you so much for coming on In Search of Wisdom.
Josh, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the In Search of Wisdom podcast. I hope you found something useful for daily life. If so, I encourage you to put what you heard into practice. If you're interested in more tools for the art of living, consider subscribing to Perennial Meditations on Substack. By becoming a member, you'll help support the project and gain access to our podcasts, meditations, and courses. Until next time, be wise and be well.